So, thank you very much for having this opportunity to be here. I am Lina, as said, from Gender Equality Institute, and you have heard already quite some, I think, during this morning session about the work our institute is doing regarding different gender equality issues. So today I have really a unique opportunity to present to you our emerging data, our new data, and you are the first audience to see it. We're still working on the new analysis on gender segregation, and I'm really looking forward to your feedback and to your overall suggestions, perhaps, in terms of trends in situation across the EU member states that we're going to present to you. So the topic of today is actually quite broad. We want to look into gender segregation, education, training, and the labor market. And why do we do that? It's very important that our education systems are also adapted to labor markets. We do pursue certain education times with the prospect of having jobs in the future. So we want to see what happens to the graduates of certain educational fields in the labor market. We want to look at these occupational pathways, and we want to understand to what extent women and men differ in terms of their opportunities and access to the labor market. So just a quick background of what we're looking at. In terms of STEM, just the situation across the EU member states, the share of graduates, so not students, we're looking already at the one step further, share of graduates, those who graduate from the STEM disciplines. And the figure here is combining data for vocational education in terms of the upper secondary but non-tertiary education, and generally tertiary education students. So if we look across the EU, we see quite some variation across the countries in terms of how important STEM studies are within the national education systems. Altogether, across the EU, about 1/4 of students graduate from STEM disciplines. Now, what we also see in this figure, that we have about 3 broader study fields which are combined into this umbrella area of STEM. So natural sciences, mathematics and statistics, ICT field, engineering, manufacturing, construction. And engineering, manufacturing, and construction is actually the largest field of STEM disciplines. We have about 20% of all graduates in the EU graduating from engineering, manufacturing, and construction. Now, when we look into the labor market side, so this is to depict a bit about STEM occupations. When we talked about the education fields, we had a bit of more broader areas of selecting. When we talk about occupations, of course, it's much more detailed. So we're not looking at all occupations. Here we're presenting the view about 8 core, let's say, STEM occupations that really match the STEM educational profile. So these 8 occupations are stationary plant and machine operators, ICT technicians, ICT professionals, so 2 different levels of jobs, metal machinery related trades workers, electronics trade workers, building and related trade workers, and of course science and engineering associate professionals and professionals. Now, across all of the EU, though it's quite difficult to read because these are 8 occupations which are pulled together for the countries, across the EU we have a bit less than 15% of representation of these occupations. It's not to exclude that there are the other ones. These are among the core ones, as we say. Now, across these occupations, the largest occupation time science and engineering professionals and associate professionals. But it's not the same in all countries. So this is just to present the diversity of the countries. It's not only the size of these occupations matters, meaning in the economy and also in the labor market, but also how different these countries are in terms of the structure of their labor markets. So, for example, in Romania and Hungary, the largest occupational field across these 8 ones would be metal, machinery and related trade workers, not science and engineering professionals like in the most of the other EU countries. In Bulgaria, stationary plant and machine workers. In Cyprus, building and related workers. This is just to give a bit of the diversity feel of what we talk when we talk about the EU level. So, after a few of these stats, why do we care about the STEM on the EU level and across the countries. So looking at the labor market and at the economies, we observe a very strong demand for STEM professionals and associate professionals, which is expected to grow by around 8% by 2025, and these are the forecasts for CEDEFOP. In most other occupations, the demand of growth professionals is expected to be around 3%. So we talk about really strong growth expected to be there in the professionals. Whether it will happen, it's a question, because what we also observe now, we observe major skill shortages of STEM and ICT professionals in the EU. And it's expected to exacerbate with the future demographic developments. We have a very strong aging population factor within the STEM field that is actually coming now into play. So in spite of this series of measures, women participation in STEM studies, in particular engineering, remains low in most member states. And an insufficient supply of STEM skills and a low participation rate of women in STEM studies are perceived as strong barriers which could impede a job-rich recovery and growth of economy. And as you heard also, I think, in the morning, these are really the priorities of the EU, is to create a labor market that would give more opportunities for both women and men in terms of having jobs. So, now, as you saw in the title at the very beginning of my presentation, these are emerging findings of the Beijing Platform for Action report. So, what is this Beijing Platform for Action? For those, just a reminder, this is a UN-level platform for empowering women. And why do we care about it? We care about it a lot within our institute because we have a mandate at the EU level to monitor progress in achieving progress across different areas of this Beijing Platform for Action. So in monitoring Beijing Platform for Action, AGE provides support to the presidencies of the Council of the EU, and we do provide policy evidence. So we do provide lots of data and interpretation of the data in order to inform policy making in relation to this, to the policy agenda of the Beijing Platform for Action. Typically, AGES reports assess progress in gender equality in the areas of concern chosen by presidencies. So normally how it works, you know, in the EU Council, we have 2 presidencies within the year. So typically one semester and the other semester. Currently it's Malta, and the forthcoming presidency is Estonia. And gender segregation, education, training, and the labor market was the topic chosen by the forthcoming Estonian presidency of the Council. So this is just to give the background of how we came to the topic also. Now, within the Beijing Platform of Action, we have about 12 areas of concern, and gender segregation actually goes across quite a few of them. So this is just to list which areas of concern we're talking about and to show how related different issues are. So we talk about education and training of women, we talk about women and the economy, women and the environment, and the girl child. So these are 4 critical areas of the Beijing Platform for Action. There are a number of indicators which are official indicators to monitor the progress of the Beijing Platform for Action, and we just listed here examples of those in relation to gender segregation here. So at the moment, gender segregation is being monitored in terms of proportion of female graduates and male graduates across fields like mathematics, science, and technical disciplines. But we also look into the gender pay gap, or going into the girl child, we'll look at the 15-year-old performance in mathematics and science. The rationale of this study, as I already mentioned at the very beginning, is to look into both education, training, and the labor market, because in a way, we talk about a very big leaky pipeline syndrome that we observe in many educational areas. So we have a certain number of students in a study field, however, only a fraction of them go into the labor market. And that's gender segregation, education, and training, of course, influences what we have, the degree of gender segregation in labor market, and that results in supporting gender stereotypes, narrowing life choices and employment options, and of course leading to gender pay gap. There is a causal link. We cannot say that, because we have gender segregation, we are reinforcing our gender stereotypes. At the first place, gender stereotypes and the stereotypical norms about family roles are the ones that lead in terms of having gender segregation. So creating these causal links and to say what influences what is quite complex because, of course, many of these things, they work together. In this particular study, we are addressing participation of women in STEM, but also participation of men in education, health and welfare fields. So we are looking at the sectors which are most gender segregated. So if the first one has a high underrepresentation of women, the second one has a very high underrepresentation of men. We look in terms of what factors influence women's decisions to work or not in the STEM sector, and at the same time we look at the factors that influence men's choices to work in the education, health and welfare field. In their presentation today, I'll only talk about the STEM findings because we thought that given this study is very broad, it's good also to focus on just one side. So the emerging findings that are achievements in terms of science and mathematics. As I said, it's one of the official Beijing Platform for Action indicators. And what we observe here is actually very good news. So in the literature, if we look at the academic literature of what are the underlying factors of gender segregation, we still have this notion of girls being less capable of achieving, of having achievements in science and mathematics. What we show in this picture in the negative scale, on the negative scale, these are the countries in which girls outperform boys. And on the positive scale, we have countries in which boys outperform girls. The picture was not like this a decade ago. So we have, first of all, a narrowing gap, and we also have a very good example that achievements in math and science, it's very much country-specific. It's not gender-specific. Lots of structural and contextual factors matter in terms of how students perform in math and science. So this argument, whether which gender has an edge in terms of math and science, it's not really holding well to explain why do we observe gender segregation in STEM field. Now, if you look at women's share in STEM, so this is the educational field, so these are the graduates. So we have these three broad study fields: natural sciences, mathematics and statistics, ICT, and then engineering, manufacturing, construction. When we talk about STEM as being gender segregated, we have to be quite specific, actually. These fields are very different. Now, we already had comments about this 40% threshold, just to give a bit more of the background. We look into gender-balanced study fields as those where women and men represent from 40 to 60%. So this is quite a range that we give in order to reach the gender balance. And this is also because that some of the study fields in the countries, they're rather small. So we can expect quite some volatility across years, and it just happens. So 40 to 60 is an approach taken normally at the European level. In the UN, they sometimes use a bit smaller range, 45 to 55. But in a way, this is just to show that the gender balance could be within this certain frame that we could reach. What this graph also shows that in natural science, mathematics and statistics, we actually have gender balance in the study field. In some countries, on the top of that, the field is actually women-dominated. So if you look at the countries like Bulgaria, Cyprus, Romania, but also Estonia, and on the other side, I don't see very well now, Czech Republic, I believe, these are the countries where we already have women dominating in this science field. The very different picture emerges if you look at the information ICT study field or engineering, manufacturing, construction. First of all, of course, we see very different performance across the countries, so we have very different situations. But also we see that in none of the countries, essentially, the gender balance is reached. So that's where we stand today. Maybe just going back this was the situation that we observed with the latest data. And we pulled the data from 2013 to 2015 because in some of the countries, especially the smaller countries, study fields are actually quite small also. Now, if we look in terms of what happened before reaching this 2015 point, so where do we come from? Actually, are we progressing? Are we still improving? Well, actually not. I think the progress has stopped. So when we look into the ICT field, so the rank here, the dark blue bars that essentially show the negative change, they point that the women's share in the ICT field studying, they are falling. In engineering, manufacturing, constructions, as well as science, mathematics, and statistics, changes are quite volatile across countries, so we do not observe that clear pattern. However, in the ICT field, and it's now increasingly recognized by different policy initiatives, we have less and less students and also disproportionately less women. In terms of segregation by education level, our education systems, of course, these are not just study fields. So we have to look in terms of performance across educational level. And as I said, in our study, we look at the vocational education training and at the tertiary education level. And as we can see that gender segregation in the STEM field is actually mainly determined by particularly low performance within the vocational education training system. So if we would pull these two pointers together for the country, we would have the average gender segregation more or less for the country. And it shows that it's actually highly pulled down by what is happening in vocational education level. In most of the countries, we have about 10, maximum up to 20% of women within the VT system, whereas in the tertiary education level, the situation is much better. So in terms of just thinking about the policy responses, about the policy designs or the focus that policymakers need to take, it's actually showing that it's not only the tertiary education that matters, but we really need to look into the vocational education system. So now going into the very exciting part. So we are transiting, we're making a transition. We have graduated from the educational field in STEM, and we're looking for the job on the labor market. This is an EU level, so for the countries that we have data at the EU level. And what we see the trend from 2004 to 2014. So the top two lines show the men performance. The very top one, the red one, is STEM men with tertiary education level, and the one down at 41% in 2014 is STEM men with vocational education level. What we observe here is, let's say, a small progress during the last decade, that happened both for men and women in tertiary education level, though the gap remains significant. So what the graph says that in 2014, given this small progress in mind, every second man that graduated from the STEM field found a job in those core STEM occupations. For women, the same applies for every third woman. And for women with vocational education training, and this is one of the most surprising findings also of our analysis, only 1/10 of women with STEM vocational education training finds a corresponding job in the STEM field. So you see, this is quite different. So we have graduates in the same fields, but their transitions into the labor market are very different. So now we try to look into where are these women and men are going after, if not staying in STEM. We said, okay, we cannot capture all STEM occupations, perhaps precisely. So let's look what are the major occupations if they're not staying in the core STEM occupations. And let's start from those 90% of women with vocational education training and check what the occupations they are choosing. So 20% of them becoming sales workers, 11% of them going into the food processing, woodworking, garment, and other craft and related trades occupations. About 10% of men with vocational education training do so too. However, that's not the case for the sales workers. If we look at the very specific occupational choice of women that they do, they also become personal service workers. We do not observe this as an occupational pathway for men with vocational education training. Instead, what men choose, they choose to become drivers and mobile plant operators, or become laborers in mining, construction, manufacturing, and transport. What this picture shows is actually that despite making this, let's say, gender atypical choice at the beginning of the educational system, when we come into the entry into the labor market, even though having the STEM, let's say, background, people still make these very gender traditional pathways. So these gender stereotypes, they go throughout the life course, and they really shape and truncate our occupational choices with a quite significant matter. So now looking at the tertiary educational level, we have both women and men that become teaching professionals, but we see that twice more women than men do so. And we know that teaching profession is one of the women-concentrated areas of work. We have about the same share of women and men working in business and administration professionals and business and administration associate professionals. Men, however, tend to concentrate more in production and specialized service managers. Women still with tertiary education level choose more often to become sales workers. So this is just to give about the diversity, and this is an EU level again. So it blends lots of different situations across the countries in terms of the occupational pathways of the STEM graduates. What it also shows that when we talk about the STEM sector, and I will get back to this, we cannot ignore that there are these major transitions made between the different sectors, and that the labor market actually is, and the structure of the labor market is very important in terms of how well our graduates succeed. So if we look at the share of women in STEM occupations, this is the picture for 2013-2014, we see, again, quite diverse situation across the countries. And this is pooling share of women in all STEM occupations, in all those 8 occupations. And we see that we have from as low as just below 10% in the Netherlands to as high as about 25-26% in Bulgaria. So this shows how acute gender segregation degree is within the STEM field in terms of the labor market performance. In terms of the progress made, since 2004, I'm not presenting it here, but we looked into it and essentially there was no much difference. We did not observe that much of a huge decline for the entire STEM industry. But then again, looking into the details more, we do observe some quite dramatic changes. So this is share of women employed in ICT. And what it shows the blue bars, which shows situation in 2008. And it shows these horizontal pointers in 2015 that you observe to be much lower. So essentially what it says, that the share of women in ICT sector is dropping. So what we observed in the educational sector is also being repeated on the labor market. So if, for example, let's take Bulgaria, which was one among the top performing countries in terms of educational field, it's actually not so much of a success story anymore. What we observed in 2013-15 actually is showing a declining trend. So the share of women there has decreased considerably since 2008. So what is it? Of course, and I can only say a few influences, and you have talked a great deal about it yesterday and today. So this is just a list of checking one more time of what are the barriers to the participation of women in STEM. So of course, stereotypes, social norms, and cultural practices. A very strong thing is a negative image of STEM. And that's, I think, where I'm also learning, and my colleagues are also learning from your experiences, and your expertise in the field, and also the need of changing this negative image of STEM, perhaps for both women and men. Welfare policies, they do have a big say whether women can have a chance to participate in their STEM occupations. STEM fields are actually not considered as family-friendly if in comparison to other occupations. So in a way, people make very rational choices. It's not that women just decide, well, okay, I'm not going to do STEM. No, they actually make, let's say, they graduate from the STEM field, and they make a very rational choice. If there are better opportunities in other sectors, and if their skills are demanded there, they do go into the other sectors. Family background and the absence of women role models, that also plays a big role. Male-dominated culture that is observed in the workplaces, it's seen as a negative influence. Biased recruitment, appraisal, and promotion procedures, so this is even for at the entry point of going into the occupations. Limited access to networks, which is of big importance to the promotion and to the career progression of women. Information, funding, constitutional support, biased research evaluation procedures, low recognition in the field. So this is just going through the list, and of course, lots of these influences, sometimes they are smaller or bigger, depending on individual cases, but their accumulation leads to big gender gaps. So just to give you a little bit more of insights into the data that we're looking at, we know that gender segregation is rooted at the very early ages. So we cannot just take, tertiary education and say, well, okay, let's do something about it. We have to go early. How early? It's, of course, as early as possible. But this is just one glimpse of how education systems matter. So what it shows here, it shows we have, in many educational systems, we have the tracking system. So, at the very early age, you start already moving from general education into more specific occupational tracks or vocational tracks. So on this graph, on the axis here, we show age of pupils at the first placement into different educational tracks. And countries are very different. And on the y-axis, we show share of women graduating in STEM. So actually, what the graph shows, what the scatter plot shows, is that in the countries that profile students at the very early age, as early as 10, 12 years old, we do not observe, in any of these countries, we do not observe a high share of women in STEM. Now, if you look at this side, so essentially where tracking is being made at the end of the high schools, we see the variation in outcomes regarding gender segregation in STEM. So it shows it's an important factor, but it's not the only factor that matters in terms of the outcomes in gender segregation. Now, I talked about the interconnection between the sectors. We cannot just talk about the STEM sector, and we have to look in terms of what is happening across the labor markets, across different other sectors. So what it shows here, it's actually very interesting. We thought, okay, if the STEM employment is supposed to increase, if the sector is very big, what would happen to, let's say, men or women chances in this sector as opposed to the other sectors? So on the graph here, we show that when the STEM employment is increasing, less men are choosing to become teachers, choose to work in education, health, and welfare field. So essentially, they take an opportunity and take the STEM jobs. On the other graph, what we show, when the education, health, and welfare employment is bigger in the countries, we have less women taking jobs in STEM. So this is just a way to illustrate this big competition we have across the sectors, and that we have to take into account when we think about whether or not our graduates will choose working in STEM field. So this morning, the representative of the Joint Research Center has already talked a little bit about our other research line, where we looked what would happen if gender gap in the STEM education field would be closed. And this is actually the forecast that we have made, so this is not for this specific study, but I thought it would be interesting to put it on paper. So if we would close this very specific gap, gender gap in education in STEM, we actually could see an improvement in GDP up to 1% by 2030, but in the long run, this would accumulate to a big benefit. So up to 2.2 to 3% of EU GDP, an improvement which is about 610 to 820 billion euros for the EU. We cannot expect that things will happen now. If we are closing gender education gap, it means we are affecting the students. So when we talk about any potential impact of GDP, we only can talk about the long term. However, if we do not close the gender gap now, this graph might become negative as well. As we saw, we are not really making a progress that much anymore in certain areas. Effect of narrowing the gender gap in STEM on employment, also very similar to GDP. We could see that up to 2030, it will be quite a shallow progress because, of course, it takes time until jobs are being allocated to match the profiles of education. But if this would happen, there is a big potential that by 2050, we would reach some kind of balance. And going into the conclusions, so these are very broad ones, just food for thought. Gender segregation in education and labor market is associated with creating and perpetuating gender equalities in and beyond the labor market. So this is just to stress this very important link. Segregation narrows, of course, employment choices and reinforces gender stereotypes. So just as for the education field, we already have gender segregated study fields, and this further on, these cultural stereotypes, these gender-related stereotypes, they further on narrow our employment choices. And that holds both for men and women. The objective of gender equality policy should not necessarily be a homogenization of the labor market by gender, although gendered roles shall be equally valued and remunerated. So I think we already touching upon similar ideas. It has been already presented here. We do not want to make women the same as men or men the same as women. There are quite some challenges that the current structures of study and labor market face. So among them, the image of STEM study fields, for example, we could make it more attractive to both women and men to participate. Gender inequalities are dragging down on women's, of course, economic opportunities and affecting the entire EU economy. We could do better if these gender gaps would be closed, leading to shortfall in terms of achieving inclusive and sustainable growth. So we cannot talk about inclusive and sustainable growth until we solve these major gender segregation issues that we're facing currently. And to reach the goal of smart, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth, which is one of the priorities for the EU today, the EU must, of course, improve existing and introduce further gender equality measures. Thank you for your attention today.